Well, as we come into this final week of our study through the book of Colossians, we're looking at persons that Paul mentions in his closing salutations who are sending along their greetings, and he's sending greetings to them. It's kind of like, being on a Zoom call and everybody is saying things to each other as they're going offline. Essentially, Paul, we left off yesterday talking about Demas, who had left Paul spatially as well as spiritually, that he appears to have run away in unbelief and fear. Whether he totally left the faith, it's possible, but it's also just as possible that at some point Demas repented for what he had done and was restored, and hopefully over time earned the right to be trusted in a position of leadership. But in verse 15, he introduces us to a person who is mentioned to us for the one and only time. And it says, "Give my greetings to the brothers at Laodicea." We're familiar with the church of Laodicea because of the book of Revelation. Other than that, besides this comment, we don't know anything about Laodicea, except it's mentioned in the letter to the Philippians and the Colossians. Obviously, a church was planted there. We talked about how Epaphras very likely started the church in Colossae and also may have planted the churches in Laodicea. There's mention of Philadelphia. There's mention of Hierapolis. These are all places that the gospel was spreading out. Our account in the book of Acts gives us a very strong impression in chapter 19 that Ephesus exploded spiritually, and then the missionary effort just went everywhere. And this became kind of normal, not in the sense that people were commissioned to travel different places, but there was such a economic interchange between all of these different cities, and there were so many people who would marry others from other cities. So there were some natural connections that fit into what we might call the sphere of influence. And I guess the one thing I would say in that is that we're usually most effective in sharing our faith with people who are in our circle. And one of the things that happens, unfortunately, that when people get saved, they share the gospel with everybody in their circle that we call their sphere of influence. And then those people either give their life to Christ or terminate their walk with Christ. But many of them also choose to terminate the relationship because, as Jesus said, darkness hates the light because it exposes their sinfulness. And so we find that a lot of people who are in our circle are no longer in our circle. And unfortunately for many Christians, what happens is they never really make any new connections with people, and they just kind of begin to clump together with the people that they got saved with and continue from there. I'm not saying it's a terribly bad thing, but sometimes we are so committed to being with a group of people that we share affinity with that we are really closed in our perception. We don't lift up our eyes and look on the field, as Jesus said, and see that they're white and ready to be harvested. And so I just really encourage people to be really aware, kind of, just have an awareness in your life about how there are people out there who have never heard the gospel. And so I'm particularly mindful of it when I'm on mass transit of any kind, particularly airplanes where you have a long time that you can actually interact with people. Very often I find myself in a conversation with a person next to me or across the aisle. And it just kind of many times naturally happens. And it's just one of those things that you don't have to really just give them the four spiritual laws the first thing out of your mouth. But in the process of conversation, one of the courteous things to do is to ask people questions about themselves, and that gives you an opportunity. Sometimes they show up and you can begin to share your faith. So enough on that. But we know that there was a church in Laodicea, and we know that the leader of the church was named Nympha. Nympha, and we pronounce it Nympha. And we get that from the idea of nymphomania. There was a nymph is supposedly an elf that flies around in Greek mythology. And basically, it can be read either as a man's name or a woman's name. Most people, most scholars really think it's basically a woman's name, because even when it has a personal pronoun, the church that meets in her house, that's basically assumed, inserted. It's not necessarily in the original case that it's a female pronoun. But the whole point is that we do have evidence of women who hosted churches. In the city of Philippi, we know that there was a woman who was a very wealthy woman who Paul shared the gospel with, Lydia, who was a seller of purple cloth, which was a very high-end industry in that day, and she was undoubtedly a very successful and wealthy woman, as was not unusual, wasn't common, but wasn't unusual in the Roman and the Greek world. But here she was running a very successful business. She probably had a very palatial and luxurious house. She invites Paul and his team to come and stay with her. They start holding Bible studies. The church begins to grow from there. So they go from meeting near a river, which would have been a Jewish tradition, and they're meeting now in a house, which becomes the Christian tradition. And we know that most of the churches for the first 200 or 300 years were house churches. It was only later on, when Christianity became a legal religion, that we find, by the impetus, obviously, of the emperor, to begin building churches. Basically, many times he took over temples that had been pagan temples and converted them into churches. And there was a huge shift. But before that, churches were smaller, they were informal, they were predicated on worship and prayer and the study of God's Word. They're very simple affairs, very simple liturgy. There wasn't a great deal of complexity to it at all. It was just basically people from all the walks of life meeting together and sharing in a meaningful expression of how Christ was working in them and hopefully was working through them. What we don't find in the New Testament literature is any evidence of women being the leaders of the church. We have women who host churches, like I think Nympha was here. The church met in her house, but we don't see her as being the pastor of that house. And this is really a point of contention today because of the idea that women are equal to men. Well, Paul says clearly spiritually there is no male or female in Christ, but there is a difference when he talks about our earthly relationships. In fact, we find that when Paul talks about women not leading the church in 1 Timothy 2 and chapter 3, he cites the Old Testament, that God created Adam and then Eve, and then he goes on to say Eve was first deceived and then Adam. And I know that may kind of put salt in some people's wounds, but what I think Paul was really trying to say was that because of that, there were judgments that came upon Eve, and one of the things that God said to her is, your husband will rule over you. And so he's talking about this hierarchical dimension, even in 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul talks about the order of how God is over Christ, Christ is over the church, and the church is over, Christ is over the man, and the man is over the woman, that there's this hierarchy in the church that is basically the sociological, psychological structure where we are the healthiest and most fulfilled in our life. Now, I would just simply say that there are some women who really struggle with the idea of being in submission to their husbands. And for a large part, I would say it's due to the fact that their husbands aren't great leaders. They don't lead them as Christ led the church. And so if your husband isn't a spiritual leader, if he's not taking that responsibility to lead, and I would say that he may not be all that skilled in leading, but if he's not taking that responsibility, then that's going to create a frustration in your life, because you're going to see him making decisions for your family that are really formed in the world and not in the heart and the mind of God. And so what you really need to do is pray that God would move in his life. And I would say to the husband, if you're listening to this, you need to recognize that this is a responsibility, which means it's your duty, which means that you need to begin to work on this and pray that God would help you to be a good leader of your wife, of your children, and even of your extended family. And that's why I think it's really important that we understand that what's at stake here really is our own mental and emotional well-being. That I've never known a woman who had a husband who was a good, faithful, spiritual leader ever complain about having to be in submission to him. In fact, when you have that right dynamic where a husband is loving his wife the way Christ loved the church, and the wife is honoring her husband the way the church is supposed to honor Christ, when that happens, you never hear them having a discussion of who's in charge. You understand that they both are mutually submitted to Christ. In fact, before Paul even says all that, he says, submit yourselves to one another. And so those are really leadership and submission are just two kinds of service, two different ways of expressing. And so that's where the greatest harmony and order is going to come in the family. But I go back again to what Paul said when he said, in 1 Timothy 2:12, he said, I don't suffer a woman to teach. In other words, he's not saying that women can't teach the Bible as much as he said to operate as what we call the didaskalos, and that means to be a primary instructor. In other words, we would say the pastor of the church shouldn't be a woman. Now, I allow women to speak in my church under my pastorship. I mean, they're in submission to me as the pastor, and I give them opportunity to share things from the Word, things that God has showed them, and I don't see that as being a conflict. But there are some organizations where it's very clear that the woman is in charge, and the husband is somewhere around there. We never see or hear from him, but it's clear that she is large and in charge. And I think that really kind of sets up a kind of a dysfunctionality and a disorder, and it's not surprising oftentimes it becomes the source of false teaching. And he says the woman isn't to usurp the man's authority. In other words, she's taking the governance or the dominion to herself, and she's using it over her husband rather than submitting to his authority. And that's why even when you get into chapter 3 where he talks about, it's a trustworthy statement, he says, if a man aspires to the office of overseer, and he says he needs to be somebody who's faithful to his wife. So all of these things tell us very clearly that Paul is saying that the way it should be structured in the church is the men should provide the leadership, the wife should be in an honoring and respectful submission to that. It doesn't mean that she can't have an opinion. It doesn't mean that she doesn't know things. And I think a wise man is one who asks his wife for her counsel, her advice, her input, because she oftentimes understands his strengths and weaknesses better than he does. Saying all of that, it really comes down to being a team, so that when Paul is talking and listing all these team members with him, it's clear that Paul is the leader, but it's also clear that Paul respects and trusts and allows them to have input and leadership under his leadership within the church. Well, we're out of time, so I better get on. God bless you. We'll pick it up tomorrow.